Today, we're going to go over how to draw a sphere using graphite. I know that this isn't the most exciting subject matter, but this is a big step we're taking into drawing from observation, as it will be the first time we render form using value. Here are the supplies we'll need to complete this assignment. Just to review, we know that a form is a three-dimensional shape. And we know that value is the darkness or lightness of a color. So when I say render form using value, I mean that we're going to actually use value to create form. And before we get into it, I would like to make one important distinction. Our goal today is to use the sphere not to learn how to turn a circle into a sphere, but through drawing it, we will learn how light interacts with all forms. And this will ultimately give us insight on how to draw any object. This is a sphere, which is what we're going to create today. If you notice, the shadow in the sphere is not one solid color, but rather a range of values. Let's start by breaking the shadow down into its parts. There is the highlight, which is the brightest part of the form and where the light directly hits the object. And this is the core shadow, which is the darkest part of the shadow. Between these two parts is what's called the midtone. The midtone is made of a bunch of transitional tones ranging between the darkest and lightest parts of the shadow. On the ground, beneath the sphere, is a cast shadow. Before we move on, did you notice that the core shadow isn't directly on the opposite side of the form as the highlight? In middle school, we are taught that an object will be dark on one side and then light on the other, sort of like this picture of Earth. And that is exactly how light would appear if our sphere were in space. However, the objects we are drawing are not floating, and they have other things around them that affect the light. In this case, the sphere is resting on a surface, and that surface is producing what's called reflected light. These are all of the parts of the shadow that we need to include in our drawing. I also want you to see how these relate to our scales. Notice that all of the values in our scale should also be present in our sphere. To get started, we're going to trace our round object onto the paper. I'm going to try to get this somewhere in the center of the paper to give myself room to fit everything. Then I'm going to use my straight edge to draw a line on both sides of the circle. This will become the edge of the surface. Notice that I'm doing this lightly. This is something that you'll need to get used to if you want to draw things realistically. If you want it to appear three-dimensional, you can't have dark outlines around your object. Here, I'm determining my light source, which I'm indicating with an arrow. This is just so I don't forget where the light's coming from in my drawing. Now I've switched to my ebony pencil and I need to start adding value. Just like our cross-contour drawings, I'm actually drawing light lines around the surface of the sphere to act as guidelines. You don't have to do this, but it is a good way to start until you get used to shading forms. And now I start adding value here. There's no difference between this and the graded value scale that we did earlier, but there is one added consideration, and that is the surface of this object. That just means I need to make sure that I'm actually curving my value around the surface of the object. I would recommend starting at a midtone. I personally like this because the midtone will define a lot of the form, and it also allows me to take advantage of the additive and subtractive properties of graphite, which just means that graphite is a medium that can be both added in a composition and it can be taken away as well. However, there is a point of no return when you have added too much and you won't be able to get it off. By starting at a midtone, I am still able to remove it to make it light, or add more to make it darker. But watch my process carefully. I'm adding a little bit, then blending out. Also notice that I am leaving a lot of white space at the top. That's because I want to pull some of the value up with the blending stick. It would be impossible for me to get these super light tones using just my pencil, but the blending stick is able to move around the graphite that's already on the paper and give me very light transitional tones. And notice that I'm working in layers. I'm putting down a little bit of value, then blending it out, then adding more value and blending that out. Now that I have all of my darker values, I'm realizing that I didn't leave as much space for my reflected light as I should have. So I need to go back and pull out some of that. Again, every time I erase an area, I am blending it out so that I'm not left with a rough texture. I want the sphere to appear smooth. Once I'm happy with the values, I'm going to work on the cast shadow. Again, this is not just one value, so I'm being careful to examine my reference as I draw. The shadow that's closest to the sphere is darkest. When I'm finished, I'm going to add a dark value to my background. This is just to add contrast and make it easier to see my highlight.